Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and today we will be discussing the Orthodox Papacy. Who's right? Is it Ubi Petrus? Is it Eric Ybarra? Is it Timothy Flanders? Who is telling us what is accurate about the Orthodox Papacy of the first millennium? And so this video will be really a response to an article by Timothy Flanders called Eric Ybarra and the Unfair Orthodox Debate. I think it was well written, and Timothy Flanders and I have collaborated for many years, and I think we have a positive rapport. And so this video is not as much as a rebuke, but I feel a definitive answer to his concerns, which I think will be helpful both to him and to all the viewers of it. And so what's our summary and agenda today? Flanders claims that orthodoxy lacks a workable magisterium are both one, wrong due to there being a demonstrable consensus-based ecclesiology in the first millennium church, and two, self-defeating due to the Roman Catholic Church having not yet developed an identifiable mechanism of infallibility or are in perpetual doubt over what is infallible. So people don't hear about this, but you have to hear me out of this. The Orthodox have a identifiable means in which to identify what's an infallible part of apostolic tradition. The Roman Catholics very obviously do not, and even when they have what they consider infallible ex cathedra papal pronouncements, they don't know what in those pronouncements is actually infallible, let alone the problem of interpretation, where you have fallible interpreters of something that is infallible. The identification of something infallible in of itself is not really a solution. And so you don't hear that this much. So we're going to find that the shoes are actually on the other set of feet. And this is something that I feel that Timothy Flanders will reflect upon and perhaps maybe even recant. So we can only hope and pray for that. Now, there's a real difference between apologetics and history. This is apologetic video. There are real works of history that are more comprehensive. This will be decently comprehensive for YouTube, but we need to be reasonable. And so I give the following two book recommendations: Keys Over the Christian World by Scott Butler and John Colarafi, and also my book, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy. And as these two books will equip you with the source material and the historical background to really get into the nitty-gritty of the topic. A lot of this video will touch on some of the elements of a video that's already made called Vigilius and Historical Ecclesiology, a response to Most Holy Family Monastery. So when I go relatively quickly through the history of consensus-based ecclesiology, if you want the context behind these things, you'll need to read the book, Rise and Fall of the Papacy. I do give page numbers when I go over these things. But also this video about Vigilius and historical ecclesiology gets into a fair amount of it. But the response we're doing today will not. It'll just give you, this is what it states. You want more context, you'll have to go to these other sources. And we do this in the interest of time. Now, before we get started, I want to remind people to please be supporters of the missionary work in Cambodia. You could do this by going to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, which has the PayPal link. PayPal link is below. You could also send money by Venmo and become a Patreon subscriber if you want to be a consistent supporter of the mission in Cambodia. We do prefer Venmo and PayPal especially. More of the money, 100%, in fact, will get to the mission that way because of the tax code at the moment. So please keep that in mind. As much of your donation as possible, 100%, other than whatever taxes are removed, are sent to the mission in Cambodia. So please support the mission in Cambodia. We're working on translating a saint of the day for Inkamai for every day of the year. We'll be working on other items, hopefully the longer catechism of St. Philaret. And in fact, the printing of the Life of the Virgin Mary by St. Maximus is going to be printed. So please support these works by going to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. $10 translates a saint of the day. So please support Now let's get to the Flanders article, Eric Ybarra and the Unfair Orthodox Debate. Now, in italics will be quotations from Timothy, and I will respond accordingly. Obviously, not every part of the article is in this response, but I do think it gives a fair representation of the argument that Flanders has given. So, Timothy Flanders says the following about Eric Ybarra in the beginning. He says, Ybarra is one of those rare men who is a self taught scholar. Where he got published by St. Paul Center, he went from amateur apologist to scholar of Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, this is the definition, and Timothy's entitled to his opinion of what a scholar is, that someone's popularly published. My personal definition is a true academic's vocational. They are attached to a university and they publish in peer-reviewed journals. Now, but whether it's Ybarra, this definition of Ybarra being a scholar, or the definition I just gave, the question is, what's this make myself? Bear with me with a little bit of folly, as St. Paul says. I promise not to do this in every show, but because people hear someone random without credentials on the internet saying Craig truly doesn't represent Orthodoxy, doesn't mean anything, these sort of ad hominems are really not appropriate. Because I'm popularly published by an Orthodox press, like Eric Ybarra is published by a popular Roman Catholic press. So that would make me, according to the definition of Timothy Flanders, a scholar of the papacy. But on top of this, I am published in a peer-reviewed journal 4 times for matters regarding orthodoxy. Twice, I'm a co-writer on St. Dionysius. Once on text criticism on the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and another time on the issue of Mariology. I was also published in a peer-reviewed journal for issue between Islam and a Renaissance writer about 15 years ago. So I have done academic research that's peer-reviewed, and so that would put me above Eric Ybarra, but I'm not a vocational academic. I don't do this full-time. So I like to say I'm a gentleman's historian or a recreational historian. That's my own self-definition, but I certainly meet the muster of what Timothy Flanders considers a scholar here. So I do hope that what you take here is, if you disagree, don't disagree with the person, disagree with the content, because I have a blessing to do these sort of videos and to do these sort of writings, particularly for the evangelization of Roman Catholics and different schismatics by the Orthodox definition. And so whether I'm at Diocesan Conference and other things, I have some recognition within the jurisdiction I attend as doing this. And so doesn't make me the be-all, end-all apologetics expert, but it does make me someone that you have to deal with in a serious and not a flip matter. So we will continue from here. In italics, again, this is Timothy Flanders. He starts his argument here. He says, in order for the debate to be fair, that's between Eric Ybarra and Ubi Pedras, the Orthodox must present their alternative. It is unfair if the Orthodox do not need to prove and manifest their alternative. It is not fair if the Orthodox are simply called upon to disprove the Roman Catholic alternative. Mr. Sellen, and that's Ubi, was not required to prove the Orthodox claim about the Fifth Council. Therefore, the debate was not fair and not realistic. Now, on face value, I think this is understandable. But in short, we're going to see why Denny Sellen couldn't do this, because it takes a lot of time to unpack the Orthodox ecclesiology. Not because it's difficult to grasp consensus-based ecclesiology. In fact, it doesn't take very long. It's because scholarship and the cultural zeitgeist is not aware of it. And so you have to paint it with much more detail than you have to say Vatican I. Say Vatican I, people already have some good ideas that are 80, 90% there. When I say consensus-based ecclesiology, even though a lot of people see my stuff for quite some time now, they're still not quite sure. Well, a short definition is consensus-based ecclesiology is infallible doctrine, is what's identified by what the whole consensus of the canonical church recognizes is that doctrine. The Holy Spirit testifies it's true if there's a consensus. That's it. There's not more to it. So if everyone agrees within the canonical church for all time in history, all geographies, then that is apostolic doctrine. And that's proof the Spirit has preserved it. Not complicated. And in fact, to go, I never heard this before. What we're going to find, this is explicit in tons of sources, while Vatican I is explicit in none of them. I'll repeat. Consensus-based ecclesiology is explicit in tons of sources, and a consensus of first millennium sources on the question of ecclesiology. But Vatican I ecclesiology is entirely categorically absent. You could try to infer it, but it's explicitly absent, while consensus-based ecclesiology is explicitly there. So we're going to find the shoes on the other foot in this case for Timothy Flanders. But we don't want this to be unfair. And so I'm going to take the time now, relatively quickly. I'm just going to read the sources with very little context. The page numbers are there in Rise and Fall of the Papacy. We already said there's another video on Vigilius and the historical ecclesiology where you'll get more context. Just to demonstrate, yes, this is a real thing, consensus-based ecclesiology. It's explicitly in the sources, and what you aren't going to find is explicit Vatican I quote mines. They don't exist. They will take things about Peter, they'll take things about the Pope being, important, but none of them are going to say that he doesn't need the consent of the rest of the church, which is explicit in Vatican I's definition. None of it's going to say that he could speak infallibly ex cathedra. None of them are going to say that the Pope's beyond appeal of the ecumenical council, all these different things, right? None of them say that. They infer it. While what I am expounding, as you're going to see, is explicit in the sources because it's actually historical. It's really there. So that being said, let's get going. We always have to start the scriptures. The Fifth Council says this in its conciliar decree. It's not the scriptures, it's not true. So we do find consensus-based ecclesiology in the scriptures, particularly in Acts chapter 15. I'll just read quickly. Then it pleased the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their company to Antioch. They wrote this letter by them, the apostles, the elders, and the brethren, to the brethren who are of the Gentiles in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia. Greetings. Since we have heard that some who went out from us have troubled you with words, for it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things. All right. So as we can see, the consensus of the council indicated the Spirit's work, not simply the words of James or Peter, not even just the clergy. It was everyone. The brethren were there too. There is a consensus. The whole church was present at Jerusalem. The church wasn't as big back then. So Peter, Barnabas, and Paul represented Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia. James obviously represented Israel, right? He was the bishop of Jerusalem. And it's not said, but the other apostles would have represented the rest of the world, right? St. Thomas, India, or at least that time would have been East Syria, and so on and so forth, right? So this was a ecumenical council without anyone ever calling it ecumenical council. We'll get into that. But is it a pan-Orthodox Catholic council? Obviously, this apostolic council. It showed the consensus. Now, the question is, the Holy Spirit and to us, is this something that the church later identifies as something that identifies correct doctrine? And we're going to find, yes. We'll also find it pertains to not just doctrinal matters, but definitive judgments. When there's consensus on a judgment or a decision, that is seen as the Holy Spirit giving witness. Just like when Christ says in Matthew 18, you bring the 2 or 3 witnesses, then you bring to the whole church, and where there's 2 or 3 in the midst of them, I judge in the midst of them, right? So you bring it to the whole church because that consensus of the church in a judgment has God judging with them. That is the idea. Now, that being said, let's get into the sources. We have the citations to Rise and Fall of the Papacy, so you could get the context. Now, St. Pope Clement I on apostolic succession, how do we identify it? He says the following: those present clergy, appointed by them the apostles, or afterwards by other eminent men, those appointed by the apostles, are so appointed with the consent of the whole church. So again, not in a doctrinal manner, but we have a decision which is known to be true because the consent of the whole church. Then we have Apostolic Canon 34 from the 2nd or 3rd century, which states, the bishops of every nation must acknowledge him who is first among them and account him as their head and do nothing of consequence without his consent. But neither let him who is the first do anything without the consent of all, for there will be unanimity. So again, we see how a synod works on the basis of consent. We continue. Eusebius, in recalling what occurred in the 2nd century during the Easter controversy, how was it decided, this Pascha controversy? He said that synods and assemblies of bishops were held on this account, all with one consent through mutual correspondence, because they'd all meet in one room, drew up an ecclesiastical decree. So we could see unanimous consent is what makes these decrees have force. We have a similar statement from the Roman Synod written to a letter to St. Cyprian in the 3rd century, where they write, that cannot be a firm decree which shall not appear to have had the consent of very many. So what makes a firm decree of the church? The consent of very many. We continue. Eusebius of Antioch's replacement of Paul's Samosata, Eusebius writes about this. How was it done? The pastors who had assembled about this matter, the Antiochian Synod with Jerusalem and Asia Minor, prepared by common consent an epistle addressed to Dionysius, Bishop of Rome, and Maximus of Alexandria, and sent to all the provinces. So how was this deposition binding? Not because Rome alone decided it, because the whole world agreed upon this patriarchal deposition. St. Constantine on the ecumenicity of Nicaea I. What does St. Constantine write? I mean, again, he paid for the councils, so you would imagine he knows pretty well how it worked. He said, united in a common confession of one and the same faith, this ruling made by the collective judgment of 300 bishops cannot be other than the doctrine of God, especially where the Holy Spirit has illuminated the divine will by placing it upon the minds of so many dignified persons. So how does the ecumenical council derive its authority? By the Holy Spirit. How do we know it's true? The collective judgment of so many bishops, right? The consensus. How about St. Augustine on what makes a council binding? St. Augustine writes, the safe course for us is not to advance with any rashness of judgment in setting forth a view which has neither been stated in any regional council of the Catholic Church, nor established in a plenary, which he means by patriarchal one, but to assert with all the confidence of a voice that cannot be gainsaid what has been confirmed by the consent of the universal church, right? An ecumenical council by consent. So explicit in the sources in the first millennium. We continue. We have St. Theodosius, the emperor who bankrolled the Third Ecumenical Council. What did he write before the convocation of the Council of Ephesus? He said, before the most holy council and the decree that is going to issue by common vote, no fresh step, obviously, so he takes it for granted, is to be taken individually by anyone, right? They include Cyril here, but it would also include the Pope of Rome. For from old, these, he's speaking of doctrines of piety, that's earlier in the letter, have been defined for us not by threats of someone domineering, but by deliberation of the Holy Fathers and the Sacred Council, not through imperiousness, but consent. During the council, in the minutes, they talk about the same thing. In passing, Theodotus of Ancyra says how there needs to be common decision and assent. So again, consensus-based ecclesiology, explicit in the sources. St. Pope Celestine, letter to Ephesus, also presumes upon the same. Let us, as is beneficial, be of one mind and one conviction. Let the whole assembly in common join us. We are confident that this, Rome's deposition of Nestorius, will receive the assent of your holiness. holinesses. Again, Celestine presumes his deposition requires the assent of everyone, like consensus-based ecclesiology. St. Cyril's response to a papal honorific where the Pope is called the leader and the head of the apostles, foundation of the Catholic Church, received the keys of heaven, he lives and performs judgment through his successors, etc., etc. Well, how did they interpret this during the council? Because, right, the importance is not what a 21st century person tells you it means, but how people alive at the time hearing it responded, because it shows you how they understood it. How did they respond? Well, this is how St. Cyril responded during the council. They, the Roman legates, have pronounced as representatives of the Apostolic See and of the entire Holy College of the most God-beloved and most holy bishops of the West, right? So he stands these honorifics as showing the Pope's importance in the West, not the whole church, just the Roman patriarchy. They have given their assent to the verdict against the heretic Nestorius, right? The assent to the council's deposition of Nestorius. So he sees these statements as showing that Rome has the power to give consent to what the council did. It's consistent with consensus-based ecclesiology. Now we have St. Vincent de Lorenz writing like 2 years after the Council of Ephesus, and he writes about how the Council of Ephesus worked. So he gives an interpretation from the West. What's he write? That by their consentient determination, so he takes a verb and he turns it into an adjective, the reverence due to ancient truth might be duly and solemnly confirmed. We recorded the names and the number of the fathers according to whose consentient and unanimous judgment both the sacred preliminaries, meaning the judicial procedure, were expounded, and the rule of divine truth established. So if you're wondering, what is the infallible mechanism of identifying correct doctrine? Consensus-based ecclesiology. I did not invent this. St. Vincent literally invented an adjective to describe it. So we see it here. Consentient and unanimous judgment. How about St. Pope Leo the Great on debates over his tome during the Council of Chalcedon? Did he say that there didn't need to be debates, that he decreed it and it was final and done? No, what's he write? For lest the assent of other sees to that which the Lord of all has appointed to take precedence of the rest might seem mere complacence, or lest any other evil suspicion might creep in, some were found to dispute our decisions before they were finally accepted. And so you can see, he says the idea that people had to be forced to agree with him would be evil, or any other reason that they had to agree with him would be evil, that they had to agree freely. So anyone who gives an interpretation on Leo that he gives a final judgment and he didn't need the Council of Chalcedon to agree with it, we see right here, St. Leo calls evil. So I'd rather not be called evil by St. Leo. St. Pope Gregory the Great on disciplining a monk. How does he feel he has the authority to do so? What does St. Gregory write? I will call the whole church together into council on this question. I will in no wise contradict, but gladly fulfill and subscribe to what is decided in common, right? Just like Apostolic Canon 34. He will have the consent of the whole synod. How about St. Pope Gregory the Great on episcopal elections? The consent of all should concur in the election. The unanimous consent of the whole council and the will of the prince, right? So it's not just the church. We need the laity, which is represented here by their government. An election must have the voluntary consent of all, and there should be no one to dissent from his being ordained. How about on appeals to Rome? Without the authority and consent of the Apostolic See, nothing that might be passed would have any force. So we could see it's a matter of the Church of Rome being able to consent to things, that people can't work without their consent. But again, that is consistent with consensus-based ecclesiology. In fact, as we can see, consensus-based ecclesiology finds itself explicitly in the terminology of all these patristic writers before the schism. Now, how about Nicaea II's definition of an ecumenical council? It, the Council of Hira, did not enjoy the cooperation or the synergy of the then Pope of Rome or his priest, neither by means of his representatives or an encyclical letter, as is the rule for councils, nor did it win the assent or the symphony of the patriarchs of the East, of Alexandria, Antioch, and the Holy City, or their priests and bishops, nor did their voice, like that of the apostles, go out into the whole earth, or the words to the ends of the world, as did those Holy Six ecumenical councils. So, a little bit of background very quickly. Assent is actually the stronger term. Symphony, right? Everyone playing together, it makes more sense than cooperation, or is stronger than simply just cooperating with one another, right? The class worked together as if they were a symphony versus the class cooperated with one another. What sounds stronger? The same applies in the Greek. And if you read the footnote to this in the Father Richard Price translation to Nicaea II, it mentions this. Now, the significance of this is that the Eastern churches work out these doctrinal formulations, and the West has a level of cooperation that is not necessarily complete. So like Canon 3 Constable 1 or Canon 20 of Chalcedon. So they've been aware of these earlier incidences of binding councils where the West cooperated, but didn't quite have the symphony that the East had over these issues. Now, the words nor imply that all these are rules. So there's a really bad Roman Catholic apologetic that somehow it's just the cooperation of Rome that's important. But grammatically, nor this nor that means each of these are required for an ecumenical council. So we need all the patriarchates also to accept. We also need word of the council to go out to the whole world, which I would say implies, it's not explicit here, but it implies that it has consent of all the churches, like Georgia, for example, just goes out the whole Christian world and they accept it. Now, one example of why this interpretation seems to be true is it seems to be presumed upon in the decree of Nicaea II, right? The decree says the divine tradition of the Catholic Church is established by our common vote, right? So not by infallible papal decree or the letter of Pope Adrian I, but by our common vote. This vindicates the interpretation just given. Now, in the 9th century, we see this in two of the largest councils of the world, in Constantinople 869, 870, and also the Ecumenical Council of Constantinople 869 to 880, which is the 8th Ecumenical Council. Now, in the first one, we see this spoken about by one of the legates. He says, if anyone rejects these judgments on ordinations made by both Nicholas and the East, made in writing by the Blessed Pope Nicholas, there will be constant ferment in your church. For where there is consensus between all the patriarchal sees, and in other words, the whole consecrated list, if anyone through the whole council of the devil harbors doubts, it will surely be difficult for the ecclesiastical hierarchy ever to enjoy stability or peace. Right? So the point made is, if we ignore the consensus, then we're never going to be able to solve this thing. So what solves things? The consensus of Rome and the Eastern Seas. This is in Constantinople 869, 870. I believe this is one of the Eastern legates, by the way, not one of the Roman legates, if I remember right. Now, this is in the Council of Constantinople 4. It was just recently publicly released. This is my copy. Excellent book. We will have a show about this. We'll have more details. So I will not give them now, but it's got the whole council translated. It has academic footnotes and a good, thorough discussion by Dositheus II of Jerusalem. But just be aware, if you're Roman Catholic, it's an unabashedly Orthodox source. The scholar's unabashedly Orthodox. It's very Greek. So it's not going to have the kind of Western sounds of impartiality, though I don't think it's impartial, but it sounds a little different. So it's still a good resource. Check it out. Now, that being said, from the council itself, I'm using page numbers from the edition where I read all the minutes from, which is actually its pre-release edition. So just take that to account. Concerning Nicaea II's ecumenicity, what does this council say? This council was accepted by the Pope of Rome, was accepted by all the patriarchates. Its canons found itself into Western canon law, and they were on the books until 1917. So Any apologetic that claims this council is not accepted in the West has to explain how its canons were on the books in Rome until 1917. Why we have extant in Latin a acceptance letter by Pope John VIII. This council was accepted by Rome, and so here's what they accepted on Nicaea II's ecumenicity. For just as in those councils of all the hierarchical thrones came together, some in person, while others through representatives, and presented the faithfulness and certainty of the dogmas, so did this one also. A representative came from the most holy Pope of Rome, and likewise also from all our thrones from the East. And its dogmas were related and familiar of the same faith as those of all of the 6 ecumenical councils. So we can see Orthodox doctrine and consent of everyone. That's how it identifies Nicaea II as ecumenical. It continues. This is St. Photius in response to the council's 3rd canon. He says, since everything that ought to have been done in this holy and ecumenical council by the goodwill of God, by the cooperation of our great and high emperors, and by the assent and agreement of the most holy Pope of Rome and our spiritual brother and father, through the presence of his most holy representatives and of the other 3 Eastern thrones. So we could see emperor, right, the laity accept this. We see that the Bishop of Rome and his synod through the legates accept this, and the Eastern patriarchates through their legates accept this council. So it's given a definition of ecumenicity, which is clearly consensus-based. All right, well, how about the signature of the Roman legate? Was this something that the Church of Rome agreed with? Well, according to the signature of the Roman legate, the answer is yes. He says, my master, Pope John VIII, in this holy and ecumenical council is following the order, command, and approval of our most holy apostolic and ecumenical Pope John, and with the agreement of the Holy Church of the Constantinopolitans, and with the consensus of the representatives of the other 3 patriarchal thrones, and the joint ratification of this holy and ecumenical council. So, as we could see, consensus-based ecclesiology is explicit in the Roman legate signature. Other legates signed similarly. Now, the council, in describing its own work, how does it describe it? It says, the zeal and struggle of our great and high emperor, and by the cooperation and assistance of the most holy Pope, our spiritual brother and father, and of the other hierarchical thrones, a profound peace has been awarded to the churches. All right. So as we can see, consensus-based ecclesiology again. Now, we can anticipate a very basic response, a very basic Roman Catholic objection. And it is, well, it's either or. It's not either or, it could be both, right? Yeah, it's saying consensus-based ecclesiology there. And though they never explicitly talk anything about Vatican I, it's not inconsistent. We could have either or in some situations, or we could have both in a certain situation. But the problem is that's just not there in the sources. This is a Roman Catholic polemical shell game because they can't find what they need to prove. They'll say, well, we'll accept this, but it doesn't say that we need it in all circumstances. But ex cathedra can work alone, according to Vatican I. All right. This is in contradiction to sources like St. Constantine, where he says that there's no other safe way to know, what the correct doctrine is. Or by the Fifth Council, where in its decree it mentions that it's by just like the apostles in Acts chapter 15. So everyone must come together to determine these things. So we have explicit sources saying there's no other way this works. We don't have anyone saying ex cathedra is a possible way. We have no one even mentioning ex cathedra in the first millennium. It doesn't exist. People infer it. There's nothing explicit. So if I could draw any possible different inference, then I cancel out the Vatican I inference. And then all that's left is the explicit evidence. The explicit evidence is stronger. The explicit evidence is consensus-based. And so the burden of proof is on the Vatican I side of the Roman Catholic apologists, because there's plenty of Roman Catholics that admit Vatican I's pretty crazy, and it's a little too far, and they need to reform their understanding of it. And that's like kind of the normie view, but this is not the normie apologetics view. And so the burden of proof is on them because their view isn't explicitly found in the sources. You can see why Ubi Petrus didn't take 30 minutes to unpack this in the debate because no one would believe it unless I just spent 30 minutes doing it. And there's many more sources. This is very summarized, but that's how prevalent it is in pre-schism sources. Now, let's get back to Timothy Flanders' article. So Timothy says, they, the Orthodox, say such things as, we have conciliary ecclesiology, or all the Orthodox Church is united in faith, or the Orthodox Church rejects the filioque, or the Orthodox Church rejects doctrinal development, or the Orthodox Church rejects immaculate conception. None of these claims can be proven. But is that really the case, Timothy? Well, here's my response. The consensus of saints and councils, as we can see, teach consensus-based, not strictly conciliar, ecclesiology, right? So we just demonstrated that. So we could already see Timothy Flanders' claim here is incorrect and not factual. Now, consensus also rejects, unlike what he claims, filioque, immaculate conception, and doctrinal development in its sources, hymnography, hagiographies, and conciliar documents. All right. Now, I don't want to make the whole show about this, so we'll do one case study on the filioque. All right. It's rejected by the Eighth Ecumenical Council implicitly. We all know, because it's in the letters of everyone surrounding this council, that this was a debate during the time. For what it's worth, we do have a council letter 350 of Pope John VIII, and it is authentic. I found one 20th century scholar that concurs with me, late 20th century scholar, and added as an appendix to the Acts of the Eighth Ecumenical Council is an article I wrote which definitively proves that that letter rejecting the filioque from Pope John VIII is unquestionably authentic. So yes, they were rejecting the filioque in the Eighth Council, but I will admit only implicitly so. But we do have explicit rejections in canonical pan-Orthodox councils, because at this point, the Roman Catholic Church was in schism. So the councils of Blachernae, Yassi, and Constantinople in 1484 and 1848 all explicitly reject the filioque. All these are pan-Orthodox. All our canonized saints reject the filioque. So you could say, well, Timothy Ware says this here or whatever, but we're talking about canonized saints, right? We go, who's called doctors of the church? By Vincent de Lorenz. He's speaking of the saints of the church. These are the people whose consensus is indicative. So that being said, let me just go to the next slide. I invite Timothy to debate the Immaculate Conception and doctrinal development, because I'm not going to unpack him here. But we have these pan-Orthodox synods, and I forget if I cover it in this script, but it's in Crete 2016. They even list those councils, and 10 out of 15 jurisdictions signed on to this council. That yes, they accept those councils. And for what it's worth, outside of Crete 2016, we have conciliar doctrine documents in the 21st century accepting those same councils as well. So there's no doubt about these councils being on the books. That being said, I do think Timothy Flanders introduces a false juxtaposition between settled Roman Catholicism doctrine, the Catholic doctrine, and unsettled Eastern Orthodox doctrine. Because, like, as I just demonstrated, we settled the filioque issue repeatedly, right? I could point to actual councils where it's settled. It's not of doubt. I could point to very recent, very huge councils that point to, yes, we accept those other councils. So it's not just my opinion. These councils are on the books. But let me point out obvious stuff that the Roman Catholics have not settled. Here's a good question. Did the Theotokos die? They can't give you an answer. They could point to the Doctrine of the Assumption in 1954, but the very two scholars that worked with the Pope to write that doctrine and that document did not believe she died. And so they didn't interpret it as such. And so people could say, well, that document says that she died. So it doesn't matter that he was informed by these scholars that were working with him in making the document. What's in the document goes. But this shows you another uncertainty in Roman Catholic theology. Jimmy Akin mentioned in his response to the Milton Thomas guy, sorry, I forgot your name, Wagner. He said he doesn't understand what in an ex cathedra infallible decree is actually infallible. It's not the entirety of the decree. So now you don't even know always which decrees are infallible. You don't know always what always in those decrees are infallible. Because Jimmy Atkin even says so. So how do we even know what in that assumption decree is the infallible part, where we're going to accept that the Theotokos died, which is why it's still accepted in Roman Catholicism to accept that she died. And that opens the can of worms. If we don't know if she died or not, what causes death? There's no infallible statement over what causes death because the Theotokos doesn't have original sin because of the Immaculate Conception doctrine. Then sin is not necessarily what causes death. You see, this creates uncertainty that they have not settled, and they can't even point to their own decrees to say, well, this is not actually unsettled. It is settled because their own decrees are uncertain. They can't identify what in the decrees are infallible. All right. And so this also leads, well, the Orthodox haven't, and they'll list A, B, C, settled these things yet. And they'll say, well, because you haven't settled this yet, this shows you have a broken infallibility machine or something like that. But then I have to ask the question back to Roman Catholics. Why did it take 1954 to dogmatize the Assumption? The Orthodox have always affirmed the Assumption. It's in all our iconography of the Dormition. There's no one who's Orthodox who doesn't believe in the Assumption. There's never been any debate on this. There's been consensus on this. Why did it take to 1954 for the Roman Catholics to have a belief in infallibility in this? That sounds like your system's broken with that sort of delay built in. Even the biblical canon, which you would think is pretty much the most important doctrine that the church could define, pretty much, because that's how you identify all the Christological doctrines. Why did it take to 1547? Why did it take 1,500 years after almost the whole scriptures were written to infallibly define what were the scriptures? Obviously, Orthodox enough to point to this. We've had consensus in the scriptures from the beginning. The consensus of what the scriptures is how we identify the scriptures. And so we don't have a broken infallibility machine. The Roman Catholic machine creates this uncertainty. And even if they were to go to issue a statement, now there's the uncertainty of what in the statement is actually infallible. And that's not me. You could go look at Jimmy Atkins' video on this issue in his response to Christian Wagner. So anyway, let's continue with Timothy Flanders here, where he says, these more erudite Orthodox claim that the Pope has lost his office as universal head as a result of accepting the heresy of the Filioque or some other heresy. So the idea is then the Pope's opinion doesn't matter. And I do agree, the Pope's opinion right now doesn't matter. He's not in the church. But we have to understand the Orthodox polemic accurately, right? It's not how Timothy Flanders phrases it. If you read the Polemicist, after the Crusades to Florence, where there were actual attempts at reunion councils, the chief fault of the Pope wasn't that he was a heretic. It was that he was a schismatic. Again, not just a heretic, a schismatic. Right? The same reason why the Coptic Pope of Alexandria has no say in the Roman Catholic Church. He's in schism from the Roman Catholic Church, right? So when the Pope of Rome is not part of the Orthodox Catholic Church, his say doesn't matter. He's no longer in the one holy Catholic Church. All right. So let me give a scenario, and I'll say it very briefly. I call it the deadbeat husband scenario. The man is the head of the household. He's got a wife and 3 kids, Constantinople, 3 daughters, the other patriarchal sees, right? I did a video on this, the Great Schism through the eyes of the family. Look it up. And to make a long story short, he's a deadbeat. He cheats. He goes gets other gumads, as they say in Italian. He has kids outside of marriage. He then divorces his wife, remarries, lives in another part of town. Who is the family? According to the Roman Catholic definition, it's the scoundrel. That Pope's the family, and then somehow the rest of the family is not a family anymore, despite the head of that family becoming a scoundrel. Now, the obvious answer is, and the moral answer is, and so the testimony of your heart, your conscience bear witness that this is true, is that the mother and the children are the family. They're left in a wounded state because they don't have their household anymore. And if the husband repents and returns, then the family is whole again. But it's not the family disexists because the husband is a deadbeat and walks out the door. And it's not that whatever new family he starts is the original family. Clearly, that's not the case. And I find it very interesting that I've never had any response to this because there is no moral response. The only response you can make when the Pope commits sin, it's not sin. If that is not from the devil, I don't know what else could be. All right. That's sort of moral relativism and moral inconsistency. Lord have mercy. Now let's continue with Flanders' article. He writes, in a fair debate, he, Ubi, should be burdened with the proof to prove that the Orthodox have a competent doctrine machine called the conciliar ecclesiology. 2, all that he needs to do is to point to an ecumenical council that all Orthodox agree on, which was called without the papacy or the emperor. It's interesting that even Timothy kind of admits there's a consensus-based ecclesiology because he admits all Orthodox must agree on it. So he even kind of knows we're right already. 3, or a smaller burden would be to provide universally binding councils, again, consensus-based, of any kind which exist without the papacy. Well, response to number 1, in a fair debate, he, Ubi, should be burdened with the proof to prove the Orthodox have a competent doctrine machine called conciliar ecclesiology. As we already shown, there is one, consensus-based ecclesiology. Ubi did not have the time, but scholarship presumes upon it. I mean, read any book in the East-West Schism. It's explicit. The scholars all presume that the Roman side developed their view of the papacy. And even if they had a very strong papal view, it got stronger and stronger over time. So that conciliar model is presumed upon. It's like the default in all Roman Catholic and Orthodox scholarship and Protestant scholarship, for what it's worth. It's the presumed upon default. Why would Ubi take the time to unpack what the default is? Right? The burden of proof be on someone to say, no, this Roman Catholic view didn't develop. All right. So that's, I think, a point that's worth saying. Now, number 2, all that he, Ubi, needs to do is point to an ecumenical council that all Orthodox agree on, which was called without the papacy or the emperor. But this is a word concept fallacy, right? Because we all know there was an ecumenical council after the 8th council. We all know, because we read it, that the definition of ecumenical council requires 5 patriarchates. It includes Rome. All right? And so they're purposely trying to get you to infer that that means the Orthodox can't hold the ecumenical council anymore and they can't settle doctrine anymore as a result. But that also means that Roman Catholics can't do an ecumenical council anymore. Now let's unpack this a little bit. Why are neither of these a problem? Because both our sides concede that there are non-ecumenical councils that are binding. Everyone accepts the Council of Jerusalem that's in the scriptures. It is binding, right? There's still its canons, essentially, because Orthodox still accepts that you can have eat meat with the blood and stuff like that. That's from that council on the books for us, right? So this council's still on the books. It's not an ecumenical council. No one numbers it among the ecumenical councils. So we accept binding councils not called ecumenical. Not that controversial. Ecumenical council is not exclusively the only binding council of the church. I'll repeat, the ecumenical council is not exclusively the only binding council of the church. We accept, like the Council of Jerusalem, there's other binding councils that aren't strictly ecumenical councils. Ecumenical councils have a specific definition. All right, that specific definition is it needs all the patriarchates and their synods and must go out to the whole world. Right? It even gets expanded upon by the 8th council that the emperor is involved. So by any stretch, we can't have an ecumenical council anymore. It doesn't mean we can't have binding councils anymore, because we accept that before the ecumenical councils, there were binding ecclesiastical judgments. Not very complicated. But let's just be very specific and say, well, let's just stick with ecumenical council. Rome can still have ecumenical councils. No, they can't. Because since 1964, Rome can't hold the definitional ecumenical council. They don't have vicariates anymore for the patriarchates of Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. They went into disuse since 1964. So they can't hold a definitional ecumenical council today. And even when they had these titular patriarchs and synods are schismatic since the Crusades. So they're not the real ones. It's like I said with the deadbeat husband scenario. He divorced the wife, he got a new wife and girlfriend, and then had new children. Is that the real family? Of course not. So is that a real ecumenical council with the schismatic parallel synods and fake patriarchs that live in Italy? Of course not. They're not the real church. They're not the real church that the Ecumenical Council was talking about. And so, because that's the case, they haven't for 1,000 years been able to be part of an ecumenical council. And so, wouldn't this imply that Rome misses the bar that Timothy Flanders places as essential? It does. So, anyway, let's continue. Now, the Orthodox could still have binding councils, even they're not formally and definitionally ecumenical, because we could still have consensus-based councils. So he says, well, a smaller burden proof would be to provide universally binding councils of any kind which exist without the papacy. Well, as I was already referring to, Crete 2016 gave a list of pan-Orthodox synods, 10 of 15 local jurisdictions signed. And as I said, the jurisdictions that didn't attend also already signed onto these councils. They are canonical, or if we don't want to use the word canonical, they are the accepted and binding councils for all these jurisdictions. So I'm going to quote Crete. The conciliar work continues uninterrupted in history through the later councils of universal authority, such as, for example, the Great Council of 879-880, and the Great Councils convened the time of St. Gregory Palamas, 1341, 1351, and 1368, in 1484 to refute the Unious Council of Florence, 1438, 1439, in 1638, 1642, 1617, 1691 to refute Protestant beliefs, and in 1872 to condemn ethno-philitism. So this is not some sort of fake apologetic that some English speaker in the internet claims is what the Orthodox Church teaches. This is the most recent, largest subscribed to document on the question, written less than 10 years ago, states. All right, so it's not what I make up, and it explicitly addresses what Timothy Flanders says is not possible. Now, that being said, Crete's list is matched by lists given by dogmatists that are saints, like St. Justin Popovich, is accepted by jurisdictions like Antioch and Moscow and Bulgaria, which did not attend Crete. The 1848 Council is missing from the list. It should be on that list. And the 1872 Council is not fully received yet, similar to Crete. And so before they say, oh, well, this is a problem, there's a problem with the statement here, just take into account that Rome and Nicaea II, Rome didn't really fully accept Nicaea II until the 10th century, almost 200 years later. Because even though they accepted it in both the councils, Constantinople 869 and 870, if you continue reading papal letters, this includes Pope John VIII and then later popes, they leave the 7th council as well as the 8th off their list. They don't mention it. This is not the show to discuss why. There's very interesting reasons. But the point is, just because you see something that's not fully accepted, sometimes they renege, like they did accept it, but then they claim they never accepted it. You can't say, oh, well, that's a problem. You can't settle things, because this is a problem Rome itself had with the council now that they now accept. All right. But this also speaks to a larger problem. What is Rome's infallible list of ecumenical council and ex-cathedra statements? They don't have any. Like Eric Ybarra says, I could accept Constantinople 879, 880 as ecumenical council. Why could he say that? Because it hasn't been infallibly decreed that it's not. Right? And so they actually don't know what an ecumenical council is. They can't identify which they accept, which they don't. And that's the same with ex-cathedra statements. They don't know which they accept, which they don't. There's a 1983 canon from the Roman Catholic Church, which essentially narrows it down to just 2 infallible statements. So at least they could point to a canon, but they even say that's disciplinary. We don't know if that's actually true. That canon could be changed. So they don't infallibly know. They have a broken infallibility machine that doesn't work. And it's not my opinion. Because Timothy Flanders, where is your infallible list of ecumenical councils, ex-cathedra statements? Do you have one? Could you point me to it? If he's honest, they don't. And that shows they have a broken infallibility machine. Unlike the Orthodox, we could actually point to our consensus agreed upon pan-Orthodox councils. They exist. And it's not my imagination. I could pull out conciliar documents like I just did that have a list of them. So it's not a mystery for us. That being said, let's get back to Timothy Flanders. He writes, they have to manifest the most conspicuous thing about the first millennium church, call an ecumenical council. Then he quotes Solovyev, Solovyev. We must recognize that the universal church, having no organs of government or representation in the East, possesses them in our Western half. So that quote we just read, the idea is that Rome could do something the East cannot. Well, this is just not true, as we discussed. The East could still have pan-Orthodox councils. Rome can have definitional ecumenical councils by any definition. Rome cannot call a definitional council since 1964, as she lost her divine character. All right. Now, the solution to this, obviously, is the ecumenical council is not the sole absolute ecclesiastical mechanism. As we already discussed, there's Antioch in 50. The Orthodox in 1998 had a pan-Orthodox synod, which identified the correct Church of Bulgaria. So, it's not ancient history. We still have total consensus councils that settle questions. They still exist for us. And it was solved, the issue. So you can't say it's broken. The Orthodox don't have a mechanism, because we've had these mechanisms. We also later did it in Constantinople in 2005 over the deposition of the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So we're still doing what the church always did. Just like they deposed Paul Samosata in the year 270, we deposed the Patriarch of Jerusalem in the year 2005 through the same means, through a pan-Orthodox means. No different. Machine, not broken. Now, we have the early church also had the Council of Sardica, says Timothy, which confirmed universal appeals to the Petrine authority of Rome. Now, it's interesting how apologists presume upon this, but we have to point out that no canonist takes this interpretation. At least no Orthodox canonist. The interpretation of the Eighth Council, right? Rome was part of the Eighth Ecumenical Council, which issued a canon, didn't take this interpretation. In the introduction to Constantinople 869-870, Federico Montanaro writes that such an interpretation that we see here Timothy giving was quote him, a remarkable stretch of what Sardica did or could have set out in the mid-4th century. So he calls it a remarkable stretch. This is not what Sardica was about. So what was Sardica about? Sardica, if you read the canons and not just listen to apologists, read the canons. What does it do? Sardica established Rome's right to send a legate to an adjacent province within their own local jurisdiction. That's all it sets out, that they could send legates to an adjacent province to hear a case that settles something in that other province next to the adjacent province. That's all Sardica sets out to do. Sardica, which is now Sofia, Bulgaria, was at that time in Rome's jurisdiction. So they issue a canon in a local council of how we settle things in this jurisdiction. That doesn't give it universal authority. It gives it local authority. This is why the Orthodox canonists and the Eighth Ecumenical Council give the local interpretation to the Sardican Canon. Now, the Sardican Canon was something of forgery and debate, essentially, during the 5th century. And the Church of Rome gave a more expansive interpretation. But the question is, what was that more expansive interpretation? It was not the interpretation Timothy gave. Here's what St. Leo the Great writes about this canon. He says that the canon allows him to command the assembling together of a special synod in Italy, so it should also come the bishops of all the eastern provinces. So here we see St. Leo give a very stretched interpretation of the Sardican canon, just like his legates presented a forged 6th canon of Nicaea in the 16th session of Chalcedon to say that Rome had the primacy. It was a forged canon. Both sides agree on this, by the way. So here we give St. Leo giving the most muscular, exaggerated interpretation of this canon, but he's presuming upon an ecumenical council. He's not presuming Rome receives an appeal and in solitary judgment decides a question. So he gives a consensus-based interpretation of a canon, even at its most magnified, most exaggerated sense, not the one Timothy gives. So who are you going to trust, St. Leo the Great or Timothy Flanders? I think Timothy Flanders will tell you, you should trust St. Leo the Great. Now, as we said, Leo had this little more local, more expansive interpretation. It's not contrary to consensus-based ecclesiology. It's not explicitly what Flanders infers. It's explicitly what I've been telling you about consensus-based ecclesiology. I will concede that Pope Gelasius can be rightly interpreted in their way, but it can also regularly be interpreted in an Orthodox manner. Because Pope Gelasius says you can't appeal an appeal given to the Pope. And that's right, because there's no other jurisdiction you could send it to. Rome has it's the first patriarchate, so to say, according to Canon 28 of Chalcedon, Canon 3 of Constantinople 1. There's no Sardican canon about, that could be interpreted as magnified sense about it going somewhere else. Rome would be the final court there. But Gelasius, in my interpretation and my inference, wasn't saying that this means you don't need ecumenical council, because that's what we see play out in the 6th century. That's what justifies my inference. Just like the Roman Catholic side infers, he says this means he didn't think that ecumenical council could be the Court of Appeals above Rome. Now, St. Augustine in letter 43, paragraph 20, doesn't believe that. He explicitly says you could appeal the Pope of Rome to the ecumenical council. So if you look at other 5th century writers, Augustine and Gelasius, it makes sense to take Gelasius according to Augustine's interpretation, because they were roughly contemporaries. They at least wrote in the same century, compared to later writers, centuries later, or 21st century apologists. So yes, inferences, but I just gave a reason for why my inference from Gelasius makes sense. Writers within the same century and in the subsequent century, including ecumenical council, gave the interpretation I gave. No one gave the interpretation of the inference that the Roman Catholics have today. So that's very telling. The burden of proof is on them because of that. Now, Timothy Flanders says, unlike the Eastern Orthodox, we have a doctrinal machine that actually works. Boy, is that not the case. They cannot call a definitional ecumenical council. They cannot determine when infallibility starts and ends. They don't know what in the Assumption Doctrine document is infallible. And because of that, they don't know whether Mary died and what causes death, right? We don't know if Mary died. We could accept it's an allowable opinion that Mary was assumed to heaven alive, right? So, okay, that solves that, sin causes death, so that's why she's assumed alive. But how about all the people that say Mary died? How does someone with sin die? Well, there's this dualist anthropology that they have, the scholastics speculated about, that Mary inherited a sinless soul, but a sinful body, and the body could still die even though the soul has no sin. Now, that creates a massive inconsistency of the patristic tradition that the sin of the soul is what creates the corruption of the body, right? That they're necessarily connected. And that would really come into opposition with saints like Maximus, saints like Damascene, saints like Gregory of Nyssa, saints like Irenaeus, the people who wrote on these matters. And so they're not even fully sure what causes death, and their only decent speculation is flagrantly Gnostic and dualist. And so this is very problematic, but at least because they don't have a doctrinal machine that actually works, we can't say they're by default Gnostics and dualists, because we don't know if that's their final say on the question, right? They don't have a workable infallibility machine that determines these things. They are not sure. While the Orthodox have a consensus tradition that sin causes death of body and soul. We have a decree of this in the Council of Jerusalem, 1672, and decree number 6. And that 6th decree even includes the Theotokos as having original sin. So these issues are settled for us. What is the solution? So the Roman Catholics have the same solution we have, consensus, right? Why do they know what they know? The only thing they're really truly certain of is what they all agree upon. It's almost like a cheat code. Consensus-based ecclesiology is certain and easily identifiable. Now we continue. Flanders writes, our Roman Catholic Church has the potency for doctrinal unity. You just see that's not the case. We have the power to anathematize heresy like the First Millennium Church. Oh boy, did we just see the apologetic of Gavin Ortlund really come to bite the Roman Catholic side? Boy, oh boy. We've just been spending the last 3 years, ever since Pastor Joshua Shupin introduced this thing that somehow anathemas are bad, this distancing from the Roman Catholic apologists and a lot of Orthodox apologists other than myself from anathemas. But boy, oh boy, did we just see Well, that's just blown up in all their faces. All right. Because you see the claim here that Rome can still anathematize people. But wait, I just heard tons of Roman Catholics say they can't. Here's a quote from Jimmy Akin. Anathemas are still in place today. He's quoting Protestants. Is that the case for Roman Catholics? No, not according to Akin. This, says Akin, is the single most common falsehood one encounters regarding anathemas in the writings of anti-Catholics. I'll repeat. This is the single most common falsehood one encounters regarding anathemas in the writings of the anti-Catholics. They aren't in place today. When the new Code of Canon Law came out in 1983, when even the penalty itself was abolished. So canonically in the Roman Catholic Church, they don't anathematize anymore. No more anathemas. But wait, we just saw Timothy Flanders said, but we still have a working, potent doctrinal unity machine that can anathematize people. No, not since 1983. You don't. And here's the great irony. In 1983, we did our freshest set of anathemas. So you got rid of your anathemas. They don't exist. You can't do them anymore. You're a broken infallibility machine. And in the same year, we put our newest set of anathemas into print. So Rocort issued a new set of anathemas in 1983. Each local jurisdiction has their own set of anathemas. Usually over time, they acquire the anathemas of other local jurisdictions. And it's repeated annually. Generally speaking, at monasteries or by a bishop. Not everyone does it, obviously. It's just like some churches do a vigil service, some do just a vesper service. So a lot of people were disappointed. I went to church on the Sunday Orthodoxy and I didn't see anathemas. Yeah, because not everyone does it all the time. Where I went to church, they did do those anathemas. So my church still does what the first millennium church does, the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Roman Catholics don't do it anymore by their admission. The Oriental Orthodox don't issue new anathemas anymore. The Assyrians don't. No church does. The Protestants don't. The only church that still repeats and issues anathemas in modern times are the Eastern Orthodox. I repeat, the only church that still issues and reads anathemas in modern times is the Orthodox Catholic, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Because we still are the church with the power to anathematize heresy like the first millennium church. Like the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, they issue anathemas. Like in the New Testament, where St. Paul issues anathemas to those who oppose him in the church of Galatia. Like the councils, the ecumenical councils that issue anathemas, like the local councils that issued anathema, like the Council of Alexandria in the 4th century. Local councils issued anathemas. Like the even popes of Rome in the 9th century that issue anathemas. Like St. Cyril, who issued anathemas, right? We still issue anathema today. Nobody else does. Why? This is why I said, those who distance themselves from anathemas to try to win a really poor argument about Nicaea II are eviscerating themselves. They're proving they're not the church. Gavin Ortlund, by taking issue anathema, proves he doesn't represent the church of the scriptures as anathemas. The Roman Catholics, regrettably Jimmy Akin, regrettably Trent Horn, that say these anathemas, they're not in the books anymore, they don't mean what it sounds like they mean, yada, yada, yada. They are eviscerating themselves. They're showing they don't represent the church. The Orthodox still have anathemas. Only the Eastern Orthodox, not the Oriental Orthodox. We are still the church. And the challenge to everyone else, how are you the church if you don't do and don't function judicially as the first millennium church does? So boy, oh boy, did Timothy Flanders step into something polemically he did not anticipate. So I want to end with this, because the idea of this video, I consider myself good terms with Timothy, is not to berate him. I think he's a man who strives for what's right, strives for what's true, believes in humility. And so I think it would be of great consequence and benefit to his soul to humbly admit what we have discussed today here is correct and demonstrable, and that his article is incorrect and wrong. I invite him to return to the Orthodox Church. Believe it or not, I pray for about 8 apostates every day in my morning prayers. Um, some people I know in real life and have met in real life, and some people I've just had dealings with on the internet, and Timothy Flanders is one of them. Believe it or not, Timothy, you are in my prayers every morning. I'm not exactly sure why. Just my heart is driven to pray for you on this question. It's not like an obsession. After that prayer, I don't really think about it. May God bless you and your family. I'm sure you don't think about me every day, but every day you are actually in my prayers that you may recant from your apostasy and return to the Orthodox Church. And so this is actually sincere because I probably never mentioned this publicly. I've been doing this for like 7 years, praying for you. So this is a prayer that's been a long time. It's authentic. This is not one of those polemical online jabs. What we've seen here demonstrates that you're part of an apostate church that doesn't have the markings of the first millennium church. It can't hold binding councils. It doesn't hold to the first millennium ecclesiology and epistemology of consensus. It does not issue discipline. It cannot anathematize like the first millennium church, but our church, the Orthodox Church, does. And you're an apostate Orthodox. You could return. May God bring you back to the church. The Eastern Orthodox have a workable ecclesiology. It's consensus based. Roman Catholics have backed themselves into an unworkable corner with Vatican I, because this unworkable corner then makes it that they aren't sure what is infallible anymore. By saying there's something other than consensus, you create something where, all right, this one person says it. How do we know he really said it? How do we know what in what he said is infallible? It creates an infinite reguess of problems. Unlike consensus, where we all just know this, we just accept this. This is why the biblical canon doesn't need a Council of Trent. They knew what the Bible was before 1547. They didn't need a council for it. Consensus made it very clear. The council just makes it written down so people could go, yep, that's what we always believed. And that's why in the decrees of ecumenical councils, they don't claim to decreeing something new. They're saying, this is what the Father believes. This is what we always believed. Right? There's just identifying the consensus. So consensus-based ecclesiology is the solution. The distancing away from this in the Roman Catholic tradition is backing themselves into an unworkable corner where they cannot call ecumenical council. They cannot interpret what an ecumenical council is. They have no infallible list. They cannot define and identify doctrine. They're not sure what causes death. They don't know if Mary died. They cannot anathematize people. They are obviously in a very broken church in a very broken situation. All right. And so with that, I want to invite people again, if this has blessed you, if this has solved questions for you, please bless someone else. Please bless the Mission Cambodia, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. PayPal is below. Venmo, if that's better for you. We prefer PayPal, but Venmo, if it's better for you. Also, become a monthly patron at Patreon if you want to give a consistent giving to the church in Cambodia so they could budget around your giving. That'd be most appreciated. Please support Church to Cambodia, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. That being said, it's been a real pleasure giving this response to Timothy Flanders. I hope you learned a lot. May God bless Timothy. May God bless all of you. I will end the show by quoting Jesus Sirach, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.